And so I guess everyone feels that they win if they survive.
Welcome to the Classic Adventure Gaming Podcast. My name is Josh, and today we've got something a little different for you. EOTB and myself decided to sit down and do a full overview of the one Illusionist. So we'll basically be clearly detailing how the class operates, how to go about adjudicating delusions, and how to incorporate them into your world, plus a lot more. If that sounds like something that you're interested in, go ahead and stay tuned. We also want to give a shout out to Commodore over on the Discord server, who just finished up his awesome adventure site contest. Been super cool. Got a bunch of people who put in submissions and some really great stuff out of it. So definitely recommend you check that out. You can find the details in the show notes, or you can come by into our Discord and check that out there if you're interested. There's also going to be a link to the Fight On magazine, which is an awesome zine that's been putting out quality OSR content for quite some time now. That'll be in the show notes. Definitely check it out. And last but not least, we're going to try out something new and start taking calls for the podcast. So if you have any questions or comments about the subject, feel free to give us a call. That'll be linked below as well. All righty, and without further ado, let's get into the podcast. All right, so since we can kind of see the Illusionist as the advanced class branching off from the magic user, why don't we start off by going over the distinctions between the two classes?
Yeah, sure. So first off, I would start off with the part that a lot of people don't talk about when they talk about the Illusionist, and that's actually regarding the people involved at the table. So the Illusionist, more than any other class, is conceptually difficult for a lot of groups and people in those groups. That's because it's built around the core game concept that publicly fooling the player is fair. And that's something that, geek culture, it doesn't like to talk about, but it's also a lot of people that are in it are not cool with, because geek culture kind of prides itself on, being smarter than the average guy. This self-image isn't really true, I don't think, but it's one that exists. And so you get like table flipping is a meme in geek culture hobbies, because, a lot of people that are drawn to the hobby, they feel a very real sense of shame or embarrassment, to a much higher degree when losing something that's entirely based around their reasoning ability in front of their peers. And it should just be right up front that that's what happens with illusions. I mean, that's the entire point of illusions. So if you have people who are very sensitive about that, like, this is a game element that you're probably not going to be able to use in the same way that you could with people who, can take that on the chin and are cool with it. It's just, part of the game, and it's all cool, and nobody's really worried about it. So, but like level drain, illusions have been a big argument with D&D literally from day one. I mean, you can go back and you can look at magazines, and people are writing in with illusions, and they don't like how they operate. They're trying to make damage from illusions temporary instead of real, or, turn it into something that was probably later best exemplified with, like the Star Trek holodeck, where it's all just, a hologram, and it's not this supernatural mindfuck that has permanent and real effects. So it's, that you have players who are kind of like that. Just think about introducing it in the way that we're talking about. Because illusion play is more for the right-brained artistic player than it is for the left-brained logical player. But it's a great way for creative people who are not, spreadsheet-oriented to impact the game in a very real way that will gear right into what they enjoy and that feels very natural to them. So I do think that it is an underutilized aspect of the game, and that it could potentially make some people who are not drawn to what they think D&D is, and what D&D is at a lot of tables, which is very, that spreadsheet oriented thinking where you're trying to just think of modifiers and getting your math maximized to deal with a certain situation. People who aren't into that might be really into illusions, especially if they are very artistic and creative. So I think that it is underutilized. But bottom line is it's better not to use this class and really this concept as opposed to gimping it. The game doesn't need it. The game works absolutely fine without it. And gimping it isn't going to make anybody happy. So my first advice with illusionists being different than magic users is if you're going to put it in, really lean into it and make it different. So, the magic user is all about objectively changing a situation using supernatural power, right? Fireball doesn't care what you think about it. Conjure Elemental doesn't care what you think about it. The slow spell doesn't care what you think about it. It just reaches out and changes your reality objectively. Illusion is about subjectively changing a situation using a supernatural power. So for the magic user, the more unforeseeable the changes that they make to a status quo is, the better, right? Because it doesn't matter what the opposition thinks about it. So if it is something that they totally would not expect or that they wouldn't even conceive of, they're even more scrambled. It's even more of a difficulty for them. For illusions, ideally, you're aiming to create a situation that your enemy greatly fears and worries could possibly happen, although it's unlikely. So you're kind of looking to create the black swan event that your enemy is the last thing that they want to see happen. The counterfeit that looks as your opponent would expect a particular change in status quo to look. You're trying to play within their expectations. And that's totally different.
Okay. And so I kind of want to go back to kind of what you were saying as well about how it's something that can kind of frustrate and slip up some people who might be kind of on the more left brain side of things. Could you kind of give like an example and describe kind of how that happens? Is that like from enemy, illusionists kind of tripping them up, or is it, kind of on the player side? What's the...
Well, usually it's if the big reveal happens and it turns out that, they just lost a character to something that didn't even really exist, and it's because they didn't pick up on something that was happening at the time. I mean, that's just the type of thing I've seen people get really angry about that, because they're not playing to be tested personally in that way. They kind of have more of an expectation that they're going to sit down and play a game where it plays out more, I guess, traditionally than that sort of game concept where you're trying to pick out what isn't right.
Right.
And so if they're not prepared for that and they lose effort that they put into the game in that way, some people can get really, really ticked off.
Okay, yeah, that totally makes sense. So that's kind of where you think like a lot of the impetus comes for people wanting to kind of gimp the system, make it like less powerful.
Yeah, because then if they do screw up that way, then it's not a permanent effect. But then the problem is that if nobody wants to play a class that the best they can do is kind of, it's like trying to make fighters only do subdual damage, right? Nobody would want to be a fighter. And so nobody really wants to be an illusionist in a system where, I mean, the best you can do is kind of create a hologram that just knocks people out, but it doesn't really permanently affect them in any way.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So what are kind of like some examples of maybe like use cases that engage kind of that more right brain kind of creative element of gameplay?
So with illusions, you're always operating based upon a situation you didn't know beforehand. And it's kind of how creatively you can put it together. So, I mean, I would kind of think about, like kids, right? I mean, you sit them down with a craft table and you kind of just give them these paper shapes or these colors or whatever. And you say, make a picture out of this and see what you can come up with. And that's kind of what you're doing with illusions, because it gives them the power to make changes to a situation. But what the situation starts out as is really key, right? I mean, you can't just introduce something that would be totally incongruent to a situation and be safe with an illusion. So with that right-brained person where you're given the paper, it's got the lines drawn in, you're given the elements that you don't control, and then you're just told to make a picture out of it. Some people are really good at that, um, and they enjoy that. And that's what I've noticed for people who do like illusions is they like that challenge of pulling in elements into a new picture that nobody was thinking of.
Right. So kind of working within the context of whatever's going on and then kind of modifying it and being able to alter it.
Right.
Very
Right.
flexible. Okay, cool. So how does that kind of slot in and work? Like what kind of role does the illusionist have within like a party? How does that kind of work in conjunction with the other classes?
So, to kind of think along the lines of the magic user and the illusionist again. So if you think about like an XY axis, like most people when they conceive of the XY axis, it's the classic, where you've got the line that starts at 0, 0 and it goes up, diagonally across the axis to 10, 10. So with illusions and magic users, it's actually different. It's that one is starting off at 0, 10, and the other is starting off at 10, 0, and they're going, vertically or horizontally straight over to 10, 10. So you've got you've got objectivity on one axis, and you've got potential on the other. And illusionists start off with a 10 in potential from day one. Their illusions can do almost anything, but their objectivity sucks because they have to make somebody believe in it, and they don't. And there's a lot of holes in their illusions at the beginning. Whereas magic users, absolutely objective, right? Like if you cast Burning Hands, that fire is actually there. But the potential, the damage potential of your magic is very limited, and that's what goes up. So when you're talking about how illusionists slot in with the rest of the party and magic users specifically, so the challenges are different, right? And the benefits are different. So with a magic user, the challenge is asset accumulation. You're trying to find spells, you're trying to find magic items, you're trying to find different tools that allow you to make different objective changes to a status quo in more ways. You don't have to think real hard about how to place your magic in a situation. That's the DM's burden, right? You're introducing this thing, it's actually there. The DM has to figure out what that does to everything that they're controlling. So the illusionist, though, the illusionist player gets nearly all of the assets they're ever going to have from a bare handful of spells. And that's probably why high intelligence is required as a game mechanic, because you want to have a really good chance to know the core illusionist spells that you need. And they don't really need any more assets. Instead, their challenge is totally in reading and reacting. Like, what falsehood can I create that my opponents will accept and drain themselves fighting that isn't actually there or pursuing? The illusionist also will carry their magic over longer periods of time instead of shooting off new spells every round, because they're concentrating on things. So when they're working with another party, they're working within their party, if they can come up with a good situation, a good picture that they've drawn, they can just keep reacting that illusion that they've made round to round and continue to affect a situation without depleting their resources as much. So the better you play an illusionist, the more staying power you have in terms of how much of your resources you're going to burn in any given encounter. Hopefully you can only burn one thing, whereas the magic user might pop off a magic missile spell, and then they might pop off a wand of paralyzation or whatever. But if you can get a good illusion going, you might be able to carry that through all the way. So your impact is going to have a lot of variance as opposed to the rest of the people in your party. Sometimes you're going to absolutely wreck something because you're going to think of just the right picture to draw. In other times, you're not going to have a lot of impact because the opposition, for whatever reason, they figure out that it might be an illusion and they make their saving throw, and then that's wasted. That whole illusion is wasted. So you want to be you definitely want to be thinking like all the specialist subclasses are, and that is that they have a lot of impact in fewer areas of the game to a much greater degree than the core 4 classes do. But they're also going to not have a lot of impact in others. So, another example. So, for a party, they can represent misdirection, right? The illusionist is really good at misdirecting things. You get audible glamour, you get dancing lights, going down an empty hallway. You can make some creature follow that and potentially allow you to get by it or get past it. You can use wall of fog to cover a retreat out of a room with multiple exits, so that you immediately introduce, an X and 6 chance of whatever would be chasing you incorrectly picking the entire avenue of retreat that you actually went down. And so you increase the chances of getting away. Where you could create hallucinatory terrain that discourages opposition from even entering certain areas or trying to approach where you're at from those areas, so that you can concentrate, your firepower on another axis of approach. So misdirection is one aspect that illusionists really play a big role in the party. Another stealth. I mean, like, you get a lot of magic that is good for increasing the party's ability to approach stuff without being seen or detected. You get invisibility, 10-foot radius. You get stuff like fog cloud. You can cast non-detection on a party thief that has a wicked backstab and a good magic sword, so that combine that with invisibility, and the thief has a good chance of sneaking up on stuff that normally has a good chance to detect invisible. You also are kind of a backstop against the risk of bad intelligence, the party bringing the wrong assets to a situation, because everybody else's power is objective. So if they guess wrong, they're really screwed, right? Your magic user in the party loads up on fire magic, and then it turns out that there's some sort of fire mitigation, like somebody has a ring of fire protection or whatever. Well, that magic user has a problem, but you as the illusionist can immediately adapt to that situation and use your magic in an entirely different way. So you're kind of a jack of all trades in that sense. And then I would also say crowd control. Illusionists are fantastic at crowd control. I mean, they have fear, hypnotic pattern. I mean, hypnotism is a first level spell that basically serves as suggestion at level 1. So I mean, if there's one obstacle that you really need to deal with, the illusionist can hypnotize them and suggest that they leave, and they go away for several rounds. They get spells like maze really early. I mean, they get maze at like 9th level, and there's no saving throw. It's just strictly an intelligence-based spell. So, like when there's that one really dumb, brutish, high damage dealing monster that is just going to wreck shit. Hey man, if your illusionist has maze, that's gone for at least a while. So they have a lot of value to the party in indirect ways, and they can also multiply everything else a party does. So when your party brings the right assets into a situation, illusionist can make it more potent, right? So if you have clerical silence, well, now clerical silence means that your phantasmal forces don't have to worry about the fact that they don't have sound. You're essentially upping the power of phantasmal force, because whatever you're fighting isn't hearing anything. So the fact that your phantasmal force isn't producing any sound is not, a trigger that something isn't right. Or if your magic user is casting monster summoning, well, you can use your shadow monsters to duplicate whatever your magic user might conjure. And if you're mixing in the subjective with the objective, boy, that's really hard to tell it apart, you know? So essentially, you can 2x any objective element that any other class introduces and make it even more potent.
Okay, awesome. And I think so. You kind of mentioned that Illusionist is one of those classes that it's starting with a high degree of potential capabilities and a low degree of objective. Over time, just on their own, just the objective kind of increases. They get access to stuff like the shadow magic. That's something that I
Yeah,
know is kind of specific to 1E and something you really never hear people talk about. Would you mind kind of going over what that is and how that operates?
yeah. So I mean, both of the classes they advance in the area that they're weak. So the illusionist, goes across horizontally. They get more objectivity as they go up in level, just like the magic user gets more potential as they go up in level. But yeah, so I mean, you're starting off with phantasmal force. It just has vision only. You don't have thermal, you don't have sound, you don't have touch or something like that. So you start off with very low objectivity. It's very easy. It's very likely that if you don't deploy it in exactly the right situation, that somebody might go, "Huh, that doesn't seem quite right." But then at second level spells, you get simple sound. Like your illusion can't carry a conversation with somebody, but it could roar, whatever. Uh, third level spells, you get thermal, you get touch, you get all of smell, you get all of that, you get all of the sensory perception, but it's still completely can be negated if someone successfully disbelieves in it. If for whatever reason you trip up and you do something that would make someone not believe. But then you get up into the mid levels and you start getting what's called quasi real. I kind of divide illusionist magic into unreality and quasi reality. They both have the same potential, but the lower level stuff, the pure illusions, the phantasmal forces, the spectral forces, that stuff I call unreality. If you see through it, it does nothing. The shadow magic, shadow monsters, all of those things. Now you start getting into quasi reality, which is a game term, a game mechanic term. And even if someone disbelieves it, it still has some effect. So, you don't get nothing if someone sees through it. So absolutely, it does. As you go farther up in level, you start to get more objectivity. It's just objectivity is something that illusionists pay dearly for in comparison to magic users.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, so then going up into the mid level, and then what about entering into like high level stuff? What do we kind of see the illusionists starting to get access to?
So, you don't have to manufacture believable situations as often, of course. I mean, so like at low level, you have to kind of make stuff happen. So like when I would play illusionist, I would often use props, right? Like I would have a real snake, uh, and I would throw that down on the ground and make sure that everybody could see it. And then I would cast a phantasmal force of the snake growing into a giant snake. So I would start off with something real, and I would usually try and make them feel it, right? So like another thing that I often used to do is I would have like computer toy soldiers, and I would throw them. I would have my character throw them like right at the faces of something that I was fighting, so that they would feel it hit them, and then I would cast a phantasmal force of those toy soldiers growing into man-sized like constructs, and then fighting the construct. So I'd essentially be trying to manufacture situations where silence didn't matter, and that they would already have some believability. It didn't look like stuff was coming in from nowhere. Now, higher levels, you don't have to do that as much, because you do get the all of the other elements come in. So you can have sound coming, something running down the hallway before it gets there, or you can have the smell of an ogre's rancid clothing hitting the opponent before they crest the hill or something like that. And you also get the ability to concentrate much more safely with improved invisibility. Concentration is really the key for illusionists. It's their benefit, and it's also their drawback. because it's the benefit in that you can keep stuff going. The drawback, of course, is that if you can't concentrate on things, as soon as someone makes contact with an illusion, then they see through it if it isn't being actively maintained through concentration. So, that's kind of a tip off if you're obviously just kind of standing around in combat, really thinking hard for minutes at a time, that, you might be an illusionist because you don't seem to be doing much. And that's rare. But with improved invisibility, you kind of get the chance to do that without being seen. And so nobody knows that you're there in the first place. The other big thing with higher level illusionists is that you really, with all of your ability to avoid detection in any way and your ability to, use invisibility and project image, you can embed yourself in an area in advance of the rest of your party and really wreak some havoc. You almost become like a magical special forces troop. You cast regular invisibility on yourself and detect and non-detection, which lasts for like a turn a level, right? So let's say you're like 10th level, that's going to go for 100 minutes, and you use your invisibility to just kind of get up and around somewhere that your party wants to attack. And when that attack starts, you go ahead and cast improved visibility on yourself. And then something like project image. Well, the project image means you can cast spells out of the image. They originate from the image. So you can get much closer to the action, and you can use spells like mass suggestion and things like that to totally just wreck something and give your party a much easier way to get into it while staying pretty safe. And that's a combination of skills that magic users, they get a little bit of that, but they don't get it to the same degree. And they usually get it at later levels than illusionists do. So you can introduce those elements much faster to a party than a magic user can. And then also bigger areas of effect. That's the other thing. As you go higher in level, the area of effect of your illusions goes up. And that's key. That's absolutely key to using illusions effectively, is to have a big area of effect so that you can show changes more convincingly over larger areas instead of just in tiny areas.
Okay, awesome. So, with such a flexible class, it seems like a huge part of this, with being so contextual, with it being so flexible, is that it requires a lot on DM properly adjudicating things. So I'm kind of wondering, what are the things that DMs need to keep keeping in mind when they're adjudicating illusions from players? And then what are maybe some of the mistakes that you've seen people make where you think they kind of mess up with their thought processes on adjudicating illusions?
The biggest mistake, I would say, is that DMs, they start looking for the same sorts of limits that you would find in other classes, and they don't see them. And so then they kind of jump off the deep end. They're like, well, this class has no limits. Like they'll say that, like an illusionist could create a dragon and do 88 hit points of damage with its breath weapon if it's a huge ancient red dragon, and or they could create a bottomless trap, or some massive pit that does 20d6 falling damage. They immediately start leaping to the worst case scenarios of not having limits, hard objective limits that they see in other classes. But so the big mistake, I think, is that they don't consider the limits that are there. Like take a somebody that has a really good printer, right? The printer doesn't stop them from going into Photoshop and creating like the fake image of a $1 trillion bill that has a portrait of Mario and Luigi in the center. That doesn't mean that somebody who does that is going to be able to walk into 7-Eleven, buy a pack of smokes, and make change with real money. Because just because the printer didn't stop them from doing that, that's not what the guy at 7-Eleven is expecting money to look like. And it's the same thing with situations. So you want to always enforce expectation. Is the illusionist playing within the expectations of the opposition? And if they're not, then default to like, okay, so then how experienced is the opposition? Uh, and to be fair, most people are not that experienced, right? So I mean, you don't want to gimp illusionists too hard, but if you're dealing with somebody who's really smart, who's really wise, who has a lot of adventuring life experience, etc., then that's going to bound an illusionist who tries to play outside of expectation. The other thing that I see that is a mistake when adjudicating illusionist spells has to do with how people run games generally. And that is that they don't typically, as a rule, give sensory detail often enough. They don't talk about in a very brief, quick way how things smell, how things sound. And so all of a sudden, when they're adjudicating illusions, they start introducing this detail. And then players pick up on it. Like, okay, well, why all of a sudden are you telling us, this detail? And they start getting suspicious. So I would definitely suggest if you're going to play illusions, then you want to introduce sensory detail into the game as a general feature all of the time and get used to doing that. So that when it's absent, then the players have to pick up on the fact that it is absent.
Wow, that's awesome. It's funny because typically, detailed descriptions and that kind of stuff is usually just considered to play an aesthetic role and is, associated with the more narrative focused styles of gaming. And yeah, this is a great example of how that kind of stuff can, root into the actual gameplay. Um, yeah, no, I think that's one of the awesome middle of the road aspects of adventure gaming, where there are elements of the game that interact with what could be kind of seen as like a narrative or descriptive layer. And it just happens in such an important way. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think the difference with adventure gaming and more narrative games is that with adventure gaming, it's quick hits, right? You're trying to get the information in there, but you're not dwelling on it. Like you're not trying to like get people to visualize, everything about a situation all of the time, but at the same time, you don't just ignore it. Like you said, it's that middle of the road. So one other thing I think that is also a mistake that people do with illusions in DMing them is that a lot of DMs, they really want to do the big reveal. Like that's their goal. And that's where they feel, like that's what they enjoy out of the game is that players eventually, really figure out what's really going on. And with illusions, you don't want to do that. Ideally, for DM illusions, not player illusions, but for DM illusions, ideally, your players never realize that they interacted with an illusion. So, getting that itch to do the big reveal and suppressing that is key, because then you can just let the situation do whatever, and maybe the players never find out.
So, what should a DM be thinking about, kind of maybe like in a practical sense, when they're putting illusions in the world, when they're putting illusionists in the world? What are some ways that they should go about that to try to have it be so there isn't like a grand reveal, So it's just something that's kind of happening as the players are going through the game.
So we talked a little bit about don't say details that an illusion wouldn't make, and then let players figure it out. So if you're doing Phantasmal Force, you don't describe any sound, you don't describe any smell. Whereas if players randomly encountered a troll, you might describe the sound of like it's scratching itself or something, or whatever. But at the same time, if you're right now I'm talking about DM illusions, because you got to treat DM illusions and player illusions entirely separately, because of the fact that the DM has perfect knowledge and players don't. So the two are handled entirely differently. But for DM illusions, first of all, remember illusionists are really smart and they know their craft. I mean, so they're not going to make really stupid mistakes very often. When they do cast illusions that have holes in them, they're going to try to do that in situations where players are already overloaded with information. And so they don't have time to really sit and think hard about what they're seeing, like in the middle of a battle. So, like, for example, there's conversations I've had online, there's some threads online where people were talking about illusions, and I gave an example of a 10th level illusionist, how they might work with a pair of giants, you know. And so I was giving the example of, you have the party encounters a giant, and it's a real giant. The giant begins doing giant-like things while the party is far away. It starts picking up boulders to throw at the party while they close with it. And all of this is absolutely real. The illusionist hasn't even entered the scene yet. So, I mean, the boulders are landing, they're hitting people. And then the illusionist is hiding. And so he casts, like the illusion of a second giant that kind of crests the hill and stands beside the real first giant. And second giant starts throwing boulders too. Now, the encounter happened at a far enough distance away that the party wouldn't expect to hear anything necessarily. I mean, they're like, a couple 100 feet away. So they wouldn't be expected to hear anything. They wouldn't be expected to smell anything that far away. It's just a matter of, how do you react? And that's the thing, is that you're presenting this absolutely straight-faced, straight man. How do you react? Because if you accept the illusion, if you treat it as real, it's real. Now, most of the time, I mean, I've actually used this illusion in play, and most of the time the party immediately just treats it like a second giant. And, like they might shoot arrows at it, or they might be charging, and they say, okay, well, I'm going to charge the second guy or whatever. They tell you by how they react that the player absolutely believes this is a second giant. They're going to treat it the same way. Okay, well, so from that point on, for all intents and purposes, it is a second giant, because the illusionist is hidden and he's concentrating on it. So touching it isn't going to reveal it's an illusion. Now, once they get close, of course, what you would do as a DM is whenever you narrated what the first giant was doing, you might just slip in quick little details, like the illusionist grunts as you hit it, or you can smell that the giant has taken a bath or whatever. And with the second giant, you're not doing that at all. You just go, okay, well, so the giant, rears back with its club. You just describe something that they see, and you see if the players can pick up on that. And obviously, if they do at all, then you immediately allow them to go ahead and disbelieve. But here's the thing: disbelieving is the only thing that you can do in a round. You can't do anything else. You can't, like somebody can't go, oh, well, while I'm attacking the guy, I try and disbelieve, or whatever. Like, that is your action. And you have to treat it as if it is not real to disbelieve. You can't hedge your bets. I mean, you can't say, okay, well, I'm going to try and disbelieve while I, but if he throws the boulder at me, I'm going to try and dodge it. No, you have to actually attempt. You have to try and force your mind in the fact that this is actually not real. I'm going to treat it as not real. And if it is not real, then you might be able to make it go away, because it's subjective. But it's you also have to do what's fair as a DM, right? So one thing that I do is that if players introduce something, like a conjuration or something like that, and it seems totally out of whack, I will also have NPCs waste rounds occasionally trying to disbelieve things that are actually real. Because in that game world, that's something that they would do. They know that illusionists exist. And so if something is seemingly occurring that seems like it might be illusionary, NPCs may occasionally waste their round trying to disbelieve it.
Okay. I kind of wanted to go back. So you were kind of describing some of the differences between how you would adjudicate something as like a DM versus players' illusions being adjudicated. Maybe we could go over a little bit just how like a DM should think about adjudicating. Let's say like if an illusionist is using something on like a mass group that could affect like a mass group of enemies, maybe with differing intelligences or different amounts of information. How should a DM kind of go about that?
With the DMs adjudicating player illusions, the first thing to do is a lot of DMs they wonder how they would assign damage to things, because nearly everything that they read in a book, like it tells them how to run it, and of course with illusions it doesn't. And so one thing I think gets lost and that I would start out with is that anytime that you are adjudicating a player illusion, the first thing to do is just treat it exactly as you would if it was real, right? I mean, like if a player creates an illusion of a cave-in, well, what if it was a real cave-in that covered that size of ceiling collapse? What damage would you assign a real cave-in? Whatever damage that would be, that's what the illusionary cave-in does. So that's number one. That isn't exactly your question, but I mean that's one thing that I see a lot of DMs trip on, is that if they have to decide how much damage an illusion does, then they get really uncomfortable. Just pretend it's real. But with players, the key is, it's very similar to reffing wishes, actually, because a lot of DMs, they have a handle on reffing wishes. Like if the player gets too greedy, then the wish starts working against them. And there's a similar dynamic going on with player illusions. Like I'll ask them, okay, so describe to me this illusion. Like how big is it? Because illusions have to be 3D, right? So to go back to that ceiling cave-in example, if somebody says that they want to make a ceiling fall in, okay, well, how much damage do you want it to do? And then if they give me a damage figure that is out of line with what I as a DM would assign for a real cave-in, that's one example of getting a little too greedy. Then the second example is, do they actually have enough area of effect? Did they use all of the area of effect in making the area that rocks are falling onto as big as possible? Because ideally, you have to have the depth up top, right? Like if you're going to have a big ceiling cave in, not only does the rocks have to land on the ground, but you have to have the illusion of everything going vertical having collapsed. So how they limit the area of effect and how they apply it vertically or horizontally or whatever, all of that has to match. And if it ever doesn't match, then you start going, okay, well, this is where somebody who's smart and experienced and knows that illusionists exist and they have adventuring experience or whatever, this is when somebody would go, wait a second, this doesn't seem quite right. And they might think that they're better off taking a round to try and disbelieve than they would be to continue treating it as real. Like it's a risk reward type thing, right? Like, because if you try and disbelieve something that is real, then, well, that's obviously a bad move. So it always comes down to risk reward for the NPC that you're DMing based on their experience. Like, do I want to go ahead and disbelieve now? And eventually, if players get greedy, then that should happen more often. But for average people, I mean, again, this gets back to, you don't want to gimp players either. So, I mean, the way that I kind of do it is, like if you're doing an illusion for dumb animals or stupid monsters, it's really whether or not the sensory elements are covered. I mean, there's a lot of monsters in the monster manual that, they ask, or it says something to the fact of, oh, they have a really keen sense of smell, or they're very cunning, or something to that effect. So those guys, I'll give a little bit of a bonus if an illusion doesn't have the sensory elements covered. But otherwise, if it does, I'm probably going to go ahead and let that fly. I mean, the monster is going to be tricked. Average people also, same thing. They're usually going to be taken in by illusions, although they do have expectations. So some attention has to be given to playing within the average person's expectations and experience. But this should be pretty easy. Most people shouldn't screw that up very badly. And then if they're really smart and experienced, this gets back to, like, is the illusionist changing something that they know very well? So for instance, like they're in a dungeon and they have an encounter, and the illusionist creates an illusion of, allies or other monsters coming from a hallway. But the players haven't been down that hallway. The illusionist is just trying to use, the fact that this is somewhere not in the visual field that his illusion can come from. And the the party that they're trying to trick happens to know that there's a cave-in down that hallway because they're familiar with the area, right? So that's like boom, instantly. That's a disbelief check. And then at the end of the day, there's always a certain amount of randomization because you as DM do have perfect knowledge. So if you're not sure, you can hand it over to chance. Like you can use the DMG detecting invisibility table on page 60, I think it is, of the DMG, to kind of randomize it a little bit. You can just assign a fiat chance, whatever. But you can't entirely, not randomize it at all. You kind of do have to randomize it a little bit in order to give players a little bit of a chance. I would say that we now have a really interesting phenomenon going on that should help people ref illusions in a way that we've not ever had before. And that is AI art, right? AI art kind of represents the same concept as illusion. Some people seem really susceptible to AI art. Right? Like we've all seen the memes going around of somebody posting up an obvious AI art, like on Facebook, and all the boomers just commenting like it's totally real. Like they're totally fooled. Those are your average people. Other people can pick out AI art really easily. So those are your adventurers. But keep in mind that illusions are like what AI art will be in 100 years. But I'm just saying conceptually, this can kind of help, I think, people understand illusions in a way that I don't think that even was conceptually possible 30 years ago. Because they see it happening in real time. They see people already saying, you know what, we're entering into an era where you're not going to be able to trust your eyes anymore for the first time. Like you're not going to be able to tell that a video is deep faked or that an audio clip is actually completely machine generated. And that is the world that illusions are in the game.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, no, that's it's absolutely true. It's one of those crazy things where I think there's like a saying that at a certain point technology becomes so advanced that it's indistinguishable from magic, and it's kind of interesting that there's a little bit of a crossover here just in the context of this game.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, is there anything else that you feel like should be brought up that maybe people forget to consider with illusionists or stuff that doesn't get mentioned as much?
Whenever you're talking about illusions, of course, the bread and butter of the class is the phantasmal force family of spells, because that's the subjective illusions that we spend the most time on. But I would say that, definitely pay attention to all of the spells that illusionists get access to that aren't illusions per se, because they have a lot of really neat spells that other classes don't get at all. And some of them actually do help with the illusions too. Like a lot of times when I was younger, before I really started playing illusions, I never understood like why would illusionists get deafness as a spell? Like what's the point? And then it all of a sudden clicked one day, and I was like, oh, wait a second. If people can't hear, then that's going to help them be fooled by a phantasmal force. But even other spells like paralyzation. So, we're familiar with hold person. A lot of people don't realize that paralyzation or illusionist blindness isn't physical. And so it can't be dispelled in regular ways. Like you paralyze somebody, they're paralyzed forever, or they're blind forever until the illusionist decides to drop the illusion, or until someone who can cast dispel illusion comes around and it dispels the illusion. But the normal stuff, like if you have a cleric go and cast cure blindness on somebody who's been made blind by an illusionist, doesn't do squat. So there's a lot of just really cool spell effects that go on with illusionist spells that are not in any other class. And even if somebody doesn't know, like they don't have a ton of experience playing illusionist, and they're still trying to get a handle on that whole, like, I'm going to assemble a picture out of nothing and try and make it fit the situation, just using the elements that are in an existing situation that I didn't learn about until a minute ago. They're still trying to get a handle on that. You can have a blast playing an illusionist and never casting a single phantasmal force spell, or spectral forces spell. You can have a blast just using the hypnotism and the hypnotic pattern and the paralysis and the suggestion and the fear and the maze and all the other spells that you don't have to uh, really be super creative with in order to use well, and then just kind of grow into the whole knack of MacGyvering an illusion out of a particular situation.
Right on. Awesome. Sweet. Well, is there anything else that you want to go over?
No, I think I mean, that should be a good primer, I think, for people on how to run and play in ref illusions.
Alrighty, well, there's the episode. I hope you found it informative and got some useful ideas out of the talk. And if you have any thoughts on the topic, feel free to give us a call or jump into our Discord. We've got a bunch of really fun discussions going all the time, and we're always looking to hear from new people. Alrighty, well, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.